Hey everyone, happy Friday, back with another edition of Copperworks Distilling Live. I'm Jeff, Vice President and co-owner of Copperworks. Today I'm going to be doing a virtual tasting, kind of walking you through our newest whiskey, one of our most exciting whiskeys we've ever produced. This is release 34. It is our Washington Peated whiskey. So this is peated barley that is produced in Washington. So it's made not only from barley grown in Washington, but peat matter that was harvested in Washington. So it's a very special product, limited edition. It is about 1,900 bottles, almost 2,000 bottles. So a little more widely available than our typical special editions, but we do expect it to go pretty fast because it is a pretty special and unique product. So I'll give people a little bit of time to join up. I see we have some folks joining. Hi everyone, welcome. We're going to be tasting Washington Peated whiskey today on our little Friday tasting on Copperworks Distilling Live. So I'll also point out that I'm going to go in depth in terms of how this tastes, how we created the blend, but I'm not going to go too far in depth in terms of how the peat was created. So how that barley malting process happened here in Washington. The reason why is because you can check out on our IGTV. Jason did a session last week where he spent about 10-15 minutes talking about the peating process here in Washington. So if you want to learn more about that actual process, click that, check that out, and then kind of apply that knowledge to how the product tastes and how we blended it. So let's get into it. I will give a little tiny bit of background. So peat is essentially decomposed plant matter, thousands of years old, that traditionally was used as a fuel source and used in the malting of barley. So these days, it's burned during the drying process in malting barley, and it imparts this really cool smoky flavor. Most, peated products are Scottish in nature, so they have that traditional, single malt Scotch flavor, like the peated whiskeys in Islay. So if you think of things like Lafroig and Ardbeg, many others as well, those have huge smoky notes from the Scottish peat. This product, release 34 of Copperworks American Single Malt Whiskey, is very unique because it's not using Scottish peated barley. It's actually using Washington peated barley. So, like I mentioned earlier, the barley was grown in Skagit Valley here in Washington. The peat comes from the Olympic Peninsula, so over towards the coast of Washington. And that was harvested and then used at Skagit Valley Malting, our partner for the barley in this project, to create this one-of-a-kind, kind of first-of-its-kind product. So this is the first commercially available peated malt in the U.S. So we don't know of anybody else doing this in the U.S. Of course, we do have some friends in the distilling business in the state that are using this barley as well. But as far as maltsters creating the barley, we don't know of anybody else doing it. So this is a really special product. And as I'll tell you in the tasting, it tastes a little bit different. Hey, Craftworks Spirits, thanks for joining, guys. I hope all is well up in Canada. So let's get into it. So to make this blend, we took 8 barrels of the peated malt whiskey. So these were all New American Oak barrels, which in and of itself is already pretty unique. So not even considering the peat part, having a peated whiskey with new oak is really different. So when you think of Scottish single malts that are peated, you think of used barrels. So you don't get that new oak flavor mixed with the smokiness. So it's already quite a bit different there. Now these barrels we picked for various reasons. So some of them were much more honeyed and sweet flavored. Others were very smoky, ashy, lots of charred wood flavors. We really wanted both of those to come into this blend. So we had roughly half and half. I think we had, 5 of the more smoky, ashy, charred barrels, and then 3 had a little more of the characteristic honey and sweetness. So we wanted to bring all those flavors into this blend so it wasn't too over the top on one or the other. Also interesting to point out, so we ended up doing this at 52%, 104 proof. When you know our whiskey, they're always pretty high in strength. Often we end up about 100. Sometimes we're down at like 95. With this particular whiskey, we found as we were bringing the proof down, we tended to lose some of the smokiness. And because it is a new oak, you're already not getting a huge hit of the smokiness. So we wanted to have, a little more of that punch coming through. So we bottled it at a little higher strength. So you'll definitely notice that. That said, feel free to add some water when you're tasting it. This product's been out for about a week now, so hopefully some of you might have it at home. You can pull out a bottle and taste along with me. Another thing to note about this, it's one of our older releases. So this was actually all aged over 4 years. We, really were starting to enjoy it around 3 years and followed it very closely and kind of checked these barrels every probably 3 or 4 months. We were tasting almost all of them during the course of a 3 or 4 month period. And at this point, we just wanted to release it because we didn't want to lose too much smoke, and it was tasting so good. To be completely honest, I sometimes say this a lot, but this, I think, is my favorite whiskey we've ever put out. It's got some really nice mature whiskey flavors. The smoke is really interesting and intriguing, and I'll tell you how it kind of differs from the Scottish Peat in a second. It's really balanced whiskey. It's just so enjoyable to sit and taste. I will talk a little bit about like one cocktail idea for it, but honestly, it's just so tasty on its own that I'm not really mixing it into too many cocktails. So let's get into the tasting of it. Now I'm pour myself a little glass. If you do have this already, definitely go ahead and pour it. If you don't have it, but you have some other Copperworks, pour some of that. Taste along, why not? You don't want to have an empty glass doing one of these. So again, release 34, Washington peated whiskey. So this is peat that was harvested from Washington, malted here in the state of Washington. So this is an entirely, Washington state product. So when you start initially nosing this, you get a lot of, that smoke coming through, and it comes through more as like a campfire smoke, sort of a roasted nuts, kind of like a charred toast kind of thing. It's not that kind of iodine medicinal note you get in a Scottish peat, so it's quite different. I also get sort of, kind of like a damp earth note, a little bit of wood, obviously, from the new oak. I definitely get some smoked meat, American barbecue kind of things going on, a little bit of hickory. So it's quite American in nature in my mind. Of course, we might be reading a little bit into that, but that's kind of the fun of tasting whiskey. So I'm going to get in here and give it a taste. Yeah, and it really, even at 104 proof, it's quite full body. So it's very easy to drink. Again, I'm getting like cedar, hickory, a lot of that in the palate. Quite a bit of sweetness from the new oak, of course, as well. Really, really balanced again. I'll probably say that like 10 times on this, especially at 104 proof. I definitely recommend adding some water to kind of see how that smoke fades away, especially if you have a whole bottle of it. You can kind of test it out in different ways. I always recommend that with whiskey, but especially for this because it does change quite dramatically. Yeah, definitely getting that kind of American barbecue note to it. I think it's because of that hickory note kind of reminds you of that. I'm going to get my little water dropper, see what that does. Definitely drop some questions in if you have any. We're here to answer whatever. Like I said earlier, for those of you who are just joining, we do have another session on Instagram TV from last week where Jason gets much more into the actual process of peating the barley here in Washington State. So he spends about 10-15 minutes talking about that. Yeah, with the water, a lot more sweetness, a lot less of the smoke, so more of those honeyed notes are coming out. Still really enjoyable. We just decided we wanted some more of that smoke since it's our first ever peated whiskey. So we plan on, really focusing on this Washington peat. Early on we thought about should we import some Scottish peat, and of course it would have made, great whiskey, but it really wouldn't have told the story of Washington State and American single malt whiskey. So we do have a question from That's Neat podcast. How does it use peated? Yes. So this is kind of a single variety malt. This is a Copeland varietal of barley. All of it was peated by Skagit Valley Malting. So we didn't blend in any other barley in their brewing recipe or with barrels afterwards. All 8 are 100% peated malt barley in this. So it's not over the top smoky because that barley was not super smoky. This was their first effort making this, so it wasn't over the top smoke. They didn't want to, go so far that it was a failure, so they kept it a little more subtle. But it's definitely nice, and it's kind of a medium peat flavor there coming through. Looking at another question here, will you eventually do an older whiskey like 10 plus years. Yes, but it's not going to be a new oak, certainly. So we do have a lot of used barrels that are aging. Some of them 6-7 years old now. They are not mature enough to release yet, in our opinion. So they may be 10 years. I can't tell you exactly how old they're going to be when they come out. So one of the things about Copperworks is we lead everything with flavor. So we don't think about the economics first. We don't think about the age first. We don't think about marketing first. We're always thinking about flavor first. So if we release a whiskey, it's entirely based on the flavor of it. A really good example of that is our Release 33, which is a single cask sherry barrel. That was actually an interesting blend. If you go back and watch the video, you'll hear me talk about that. But it ended up having some relatively younger whiskey in it. But we didn't care. We were going to release it because we loved the way it tasted, even though we did have to put 30 months on the label, even though the majority of it was more like 4 or 5 years. And that's because, we're always leading with flavor. So 10-year whiskey, probably with some used barrels, that is on the horizon, in 3 or 4 years from Copperworks. But I can't say precisely because we're always going to release that when we think it tastes best. So it could be 9 years, could be 12, 15. If I had to guess, 8 to 12, somewhere in that range for the used barrels. Another question here. After the batch, did you guys think of anything retroactively you'd do different? Just asking. Yeah, I think, one of the interesting things is we're kind of trying to push the limits on how much smoke can get into that barley without, giving it sort of an acrid to overly smoked flavor. And that, of course, is not necessarily our job, but more Skagit Valley Malting, our malting partner. So they have been working on different methods for getting that smoke in there. That said, releasing this particular barley with used barrels will be really interesting as well. So I'm not necessarily saying we wouldn't have done this one and we would do that instead, but that'll be a different thing that will be good. Hey, Mark, thanks for the kind words. Amazing. Can't wait to pick up the bottles. I know Mark tasted it earlier at a virtual event, so that's pretty cool. That's Neat Podcast says, did you barrel any heavily? I assume that means heavily peated. We didn't. So we've only done 2 batches of this, and this one was quite light. The one we just did recently and put into barrels is a little bit heavier. But just to reiterate, kind of the methodology at Skagit Valley Malting is to, kind of work up to, more heavy levels of peat. Not necessarily going to go over the top right away because we don't want to produce something that ends up being off-putting. So we want to kind of get there gradually and organically. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is the first commercially available peated malt in the U.S. So this is a really innovative, novel project. So, we don't want to, get to a place where we've made something bad because we've been too aggressive in that production. So it's very iterative, and we're going to be this every year, so but only something like 12 barrels. We will be repeating that. We'll be looking at barrels from this run of whiskey that's still available. So we didn't use them all in this release. Let's see. Okay, that was just the end of that question. So back to the flavors here. Yeah, so definitely really nice balance of sweet and honey, and with sort of hickory, cedar, American barbecue kind of notes. Definitely some savory things as well, kind of like fire roasted tomatoes, things like that. Again, a lot of nutty notes as well. So really, really balanced with lots of things across the spectrum. How to drink this, I kind of hinted at this earlier. I would stick to neat. I think it's just so interesting, such a unique product, being that it is a peated whiskey, but it tastes nothing like the peated whiskeys in Scotland. Kind of want to celebrate it for what it is. That said, I think it's great in a penicillin cocktail, which is typically blended scotch, lemon juice, a ginger honey syrup, and then a float of peated scotch. But I'd probably just use this as the blended scotch and make something that has kind of a nice balanced peated note. I think that the ginger honey would go really well with this because of the honey notes I've been mentioning throughout this whole session. So check out the penicillin cocktail. It's amazing cocktail in general. So even if you don't use it with this, try it with some whiskey you have at home right now. That is a cocktail from Milk and Honey. It's kind of a modern classic at this point. So it's not a super old cocktail, but it's super well known at this point. So check that out. Again, just enjoy this neat, especially as we go into the winter. I think this is going to be a good one for, sitting in front of a fireplace or, just sitting in a warm room for the holidays. Be nice to sip on. And maybe even eat it with some, smoked meat, since I was mentioning those flavors. I think it would make a really nice pairing. So check it out. So this is available right now on our online store. So like I mentioned, it is pretty limited. I don't know how long it will last exactly. What's cool about our store right now is we have 3 pretty distinctive whiskeys. Those of you that follow us know that, every release of whiskey we do is different, but typically we only have one at a time. Right now for the holidays, we have this, which is release 34, the Washington Peated Malt. We have release 33, which is a single cask Fino sherry matured whiskey. And then we have release 31, which is our small batch release. So that's kind of what we call our standard release in a way, which is, not very standard. It's still only, I think, like 1,700 bottles. So pretty limited edition in and of itself. So 3 different whiskeys, kind of one that's going to be more classic, what you can expect from Copperworks all the time. One with the sherry cask, and then of course this brand new and super innovative Washington Peated. So check out the online store, pick up those bottles, send some gifts around. We appreciate the support. We appreciate you supporting small local brands this holiday season instead of the huge brands. So check that out, store.copperworksdistilling.com. Of course, we have our gins in there as well, and our vodka, and some pretty cool merchandise, some cool glassware, things like that. But I won't get too salesy on you guys now. Coming up, we have another interesting one. So tomorrow, I'll give you guys a little preview. Tomorrow, we're releasing our First Cut subscription program. So that's a program where you can get early access to any releases we do for an entire year. So this will be for 2021. It's $120, but it comes with a cask strength single cask bottling. This one comes from cask 61, and it's actually a hybrid French and American oak wood barrel, and it's aged for almost 6 years. So it's a pretty interesting whiskey from us. It has quite different flavor profile. I'll be back next week on Friday to talk about the tasting of that barrel, so I'll give a lot more details. But look for that launching tomorrow. Really fun gift because you're given a bottle and early access, or grab it for yourself because it's quite tasty. And you'll be getting early access to all our spirits next year. So check that out. Also, you might have noticed we're doing the 12 Days of Copperworks. It's a new deal every day for the holiday season. Last one is tomorrow. So today's is 25% off our barrel-aged honey. Tomorrow, tune in to find out what the deal is for the last day. Don't know if anybody has any more questions, but hope you enjoyed talking through this Washington Peated whiskey. Again, next week I'll be talking about that French New American Oak hybrid cask 61. So that'll be Friday, 4 p.m. Pacific time, kind of the same time as this. So happy holidays, everyone. We'll see you then. Cheers.